how differences were cropping up in terms of how do we, what do we get, if we go forward and support the World War II effort of the British, what do we get in return? That's where I think we talk about the fact that the freedom movement, despite all the euphoria that was involved, was also a very clear-cut, hard-nosed negotiation process, right? Where there was a clear case of what do we get in return if we do something. So at this point of time, when the differences started enlarging between the Indian freedom movement leaders and the British government as such, there was pressure built up from President Roosevelt of the USA, Chiang Kai-shek of China, Labour Party leaders of Britain, to do something to bridge the gap. And that was the point, I think, a very important mission happened. And that's the sending of one of the cabinet members, Stafford Cripps, to India on a Cripps mission, which came in the late March 1942. I think this was a very good lesson for all IR students also in terms of how strategy and negotiations work in international relations, or how negotiations work between different components. Because any negotiation, you see, it's dependent on one of the particular, if we go by the nature of negotiation, one of the important parts of negotiation is that how much power do you give to the person who is coming as a negotiator? Is he going to be a puppet of someone who will not be able to bargain or negotiate? So he comes with his hands tied on the back. So I think that was one of the major problems with the Cripps mission, that Cripps came with a declaration which was my way or the highway. So it was either you support this movement on our terms, which were dominion status for India, and after the war, the possibility of discussing on a constitution, that also where the representatives, for example, from it had words like it will take care of the different parties within India, and it had words like how the representatives of the princely states will be decided by the princes and not really by the people. So I think there were major differences in the declaration itself, and Gandhi made it very clear when Cripps went and met Gandhi that why did you come here? What's the purpose of you coming here if you were to give this only to me? So I think it was a failure from the very start, and negotiations between Cripps and the Congress leaders broke down, because as I said, Cripps was rather sent as a puppet of the declaration, which was already drafted with people like Churchill and the Secretary of State like Ameri and all. So it made it very difficult, even if Cripps wanted to really, talk in terms of concessions and compromises from both the sides. So I think the failure of the Cripps mission was important, because by this time, there was a large feeling, including a feeling in Gandhi itself, in Gandhi himself, that the time had come for a final assault on imperialism as such. So by the time Cripps went back with the failure of the Cripps mission, I think that was really the important time in terms of the coming of a realization that the British are for no good in this, and there is no relent from this point of time, and there was a time has come when there has to be that mass struggle. And I think that is really the genesis of the Bharat Chhoro Andolan, or the August Kranti, as we call it. And I think the timing of August Kranti is important. 8 August, everyone assembled at Bombay. And before this, I think the Wardha resolution was very important, which happened in July 1942, in terms of really bringing forward the fact that India, or the Indian National Congress, and the people were ready for a mass struggle or a Quit India movement as such. So the meeting at Gauliya Tank happened on 8 August, and as I said, there was a planning that people had assembled in large numbers. The enthusiasm that was shown was unprecedented, and there was a larger plan that 9 August would be the day when the movement would really start. And why 9 August? It's very important, because in 1925, in 9 August, something happened in Kakori. So it's a reflection of that important Kakori conspiracy, Kakori case, Kakori train robbery, how you look at from it matters. I think it was planned on the same day, where People like Asafullah Khan and Chandrasekhar Azad were involved in the Kakwari train incident. So, but as I said, leaders were swooped away in the early hours of 9 August, and they were put in different detention centers. And from that time onwards, Quit India movement started in a very leaderless fashion, in the sense that there was a larger diktat, or there was a larger dictum given to the people in terms of karenge amarenge, and in terms of the fact that use non-violence as the measure. But as I said, because there was a larger space left out in terms of the interpretation of non-violence itself, I think this important movement is important in the sense that the line between non-violence and violence, what does it really mean to be violent and what does it really mean to be non-violent? Are you really non-violent if you are not killing persons, if you are just destroying properties? So this is an important facet of the Quit India movement. And I said there was unparalleled heroism and militance, and also brutal repression from the British. So we will see that the British were already, with their ordinance resolution in 1940, already prepared for such a mass struggle to stop the mass struggle, repress the mass struggle at the earliest possible date. So there was a readiness already from the British side, and the fact that this was World War II, and martial law measures were quickly applied all over India in terms of repressing the movement that was emerging. So this was a time when Gandhi also felt, when he started the Quit India movement, Gandhi also felt that silence at this moment would mean that we give in to accepting the fact that Britain will decide our fate. So I think this was the time when Gandhi really felt that this is the time to move on to the next level. So now, by spring 1942, it is rashly reported by writers and authors that there was a feeling in Gandhi that the mass struggle was almost inevitable. And popular discontent was already rising in terms of the rising price, in terms of wartime shortage, in terms of even the feeling that there was an imminent British collapse. Stories of British reversals in Southeast Asia, stories of British soldiers wounded and dead being brought from the northeastern Burma border fight. So I think the war had come very close to India, and I think I not dwell into it, but this simultaneously another force is operating from across the border in the terms of the Azad Hind Force that was started by Subhash Chandra Bose. And at this time, mass demonstrations were found in certain places where there was Indian diaspora in parts of Southeast Asia also. Now, people were so much worried about the situation that they even started going to the banks and post office and withdrawing their deposits from there, and hoarding gold and silver and coins. And most of this thing was happening mostly in Eastern UP, Bihar, and Madras Presidency. And at this point of time, even before the Quit India movement started, I think it is very reflective that in one of the interviews that Gandhi gives to Louis Fisher, Gandhi makes it very clear that he was becoming impatient with how the British was dealing with the Indian call for Indian freedom. Congress Committee. Now, on 8 August 1949 at the Gaulia tank, this is important what Gandhi said here. He says, here is a mantra, a short one that I give you. You may imprint in your hearts and let every breath of yours give expression to it. The mantra is do or die. We shall free India or die in the attempt. We shall not live to see the perpetuation of our slavery. This is the call that he gave on 8 August. Now, with this call, different instructions were given, broad-based instructions of how government servants should act, how soldiers, which were with the British Army, should act, how princes should act, how students should act, how zamindars should act. And Viceroy Lilingau, in his personal letter to the governors, said, I feel very strongly that the only possible answer to a declaration of war by any section of Congress in the present circumstance would be to crush the organization as a whole. 6 and 7 weeks after 9 August, upsurge was there all over the country in India, to the proportions of almost rebellion in Bihar and Eastern UP. BHU students went to villages and said, Thana jalao, station phuk do, Angrez bhag gaya. So the idea was to attack and do anything to put down the symbol of government authority, That was the British authority. So everything was attacked, everything was picketed that was associated with the authority of British, right? So, as I said, many important centers like Azamgarh, Balia, Gorakhpur, Eastern UP, Gaya, Bhagalpur, Saran, Purnia, Sabat, Muzaffarpur, and Champaran in Bihar. These were major places where rebellion, it was getting into the proportions of even a rebellion. First week after August 9, 250 railway stations were damaged. 500 post offices and 150 police stations were attacked. Telegram and telephone stations were cut in 8,500 places. So this was the immensity of the struggle that was going on. Although, as I keep on saying, you can debate how the struggle was controlled or not controlled, where its direction was going. End of 1942, 6,000 persons were arrested, 26,000 people were convicted, 18,000 people were detained according to the Defense of India rules. Suppression almost succeeded. The ultimate suppression of the movement as such, not the idea of Quit India, succeeded in 8 or 7 weeks. So there was a cessation of the mass struggle that was seen, but as I said, not the idea of Quit India. But as the mass struggles, as the mass struggle came down, there was underground networks which were consolidating. With the rise of underground leaders like Achyut Patwardhan, Aruna Asaf Ali, Ram Manohar Lohia, C. Kripalani, Chotubai Puranaik, Biju Patnaik, and Jayaprakash Narayan after his escape from the jail. Right? So a lot of underground works were going on in terms of keeping up the morale of the idea of Quit India as such. And these were very strong in places like Bombay, Pune, Satara, Baroda, other parts of Gujarat, Karnataka, Kerala, Andhra Pradesh, UP, Bihar, and Delhi. There was something called a Congress radio, which was operating from certain parts of Bombay city, and it even reached the Madras presidency. Ram Manohar Lohia used to broadcast from that radio, trying to connect to people, till the time it was confiscated by the police in 1942. So by this time, Gandhi was in Aga Khan Palace in Pune, and in February 1943, he started his 21st days of fast, which really spread to other countries also, and there were demands from certain other places abroad and within India, from certain media organizations to free Gandhi, because there was really a threat of Gandhi's life at that point of time, whether he would be able to go on for the 21 days of fast. By this time, I think there were many, many instances where the loyalty that Indians showed towards British government as such were loosening to a certain extent, whether it was even the jailers in jails, or whether it was the resignation of Indian members of the Viceroy's Executive Council, MS NE, NR Sarkar, HP Modi. Winston Churchill cabinet at this point of time said, "This hour of triumph everywhere in the world was not the time to crawl before a miserable old man who has always been our enemy." Lilingau, in fact, was actually thinking about a possible Gandhi's death. He said, 6 months of unpleasantness stayed steadily declining in volume, little or nothing at end. This was the kind of, response that the British authorities were giving. Otherwise, there were even a plane reserved for taking Gandhi's ashes from Aga Khan Palace whenever that happened. So see how there was differing viewpoints as to how the movement was enveloping. But all these things led to the rising of public morale, anti-British sentiments, and parallel governments were established in many parts of India, whereby there was no reach of the British government for a couple of days. Of course, they were taken over after a few days or after a few years. In places like Balia in eastern UP, in places like Tamluk of Midnapur district in West Bengal, in places like Satara in Maharashtra, where one of our future cabinet ministers or defense minister, Y.B. Chavan, was an important leader. So there was a new high in popular participation of the national cause. Even the Raja of Darbhanga, he refused to use the armed retainees to be allowed to be used by the government. So there was a sense whereby there was an increasing erosion of loyalty that was being shown to the British government by its own officers also. The Muslim League, although was not very supportive of the response that the INC was giving, did not act as informers during that period of time. So, two questions important at this point of time, as I said, whether it was spontaneous or not. I think one resolution of the Congress Committee on 8 August 1942 makes it very clear that there was a larger sense of unpreparedness or uncertainty in the sense that leaders were taken away and people had to do things on their own. But this was foreseen by the Congress in some sense. And this line puts it very clearly. It says, a time may come when it may not be possible to issue instructions or for instructions to reach our people, and when no Congress committee can function. When this happens, every man and woman who is participating in this movement must function for himself or herself within the four corners of general instructions issued. Every Indian who strives for it must be his own guide. So there was already a foreseeing of how the British government was going to respond to the starting of such a mass struggle in India. So I would say Congress was already ideologically, politically, and organizationally sort of prepared for such a kind of struggle that was coming. Next is use of violence. There can be differing interpretations on that, as I said. Many people went with the idea that as long as people were not killed, it was not transgressing the idea of non-violence of Gandhi. But as I said, there were many cases where it went uncontrolled, some British officers were killed. So there can be very different interpretations on how you treat the use of violence and non-violence in this particular movement. But I think the most important thing that Quit India movement did, whether the mass struggle was crushed down or not, I think it's the demand for independence as an immediate agenda, now or never. No retreat from here. Future negotiations would be only about transfer of power, nothing else. So it went to a different level of negotiation altogether. Independence was no longer a matter of bargain, but it was a matter that India should have right now. With Gandhi's release on 6 May 1944 on medical grounds, political activity regained momentum. It went in a different format, again with the idea, with communication from the British government regarding the Webble or the Simla conference, as was called, which started after that, which I will not deal into because by that time the mass struggle of Quit India movement had come to an end. And I think the most important thing about Quit India is that despite the uncertainty, because talking about the uncertainty of it, I think I would like to quote one of the luminaries of our university, M.B. Kamatji, when he writes, when he gave an interview about when he was 21 years old and distributing pamphlets near Gaulia Tank in Bombay. And he says, I remember the confusion over the slogan, Karenge ya marenge. What are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to die? How are we supposed to fight the British? He talks about how different pamphlets came from nowhere in front of his doors, talking about passive and active actions. How do you detach and how do you do something to the government? And one line he uses, it's very interesting. He says, we had no clue then that we were so close to independence. Even in 1946, we were not sure if we would be free. So I think that's the beauty of reflecting on history and finding for a time that how history could have been seen by people who were living and doing those things at that point of time, and how we stand apart from history and look at things and we see that, okay, 1947 was very close, 5 years down the line. But people of that time would have never thought that 1942, that time, after 5 years, they would be free Indians. So I think it's an important reflection on the importance of the movement as such, whether it was desperate or not. I would welcome a lot of questions. To end with, I think I end with a quote from one of my favorite works, Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. Different format, French Revolution, uncertain times, Industrial Revolution in England, but that phrase captures the uncertainty and the period of 1942. He says, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, it was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was a season of light It was a season of darkness. It was a spring of hope. It was a winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going directly to heaven, and we were all going directly the other way. Thank you.
Very interesting presentation indeed. I'm sure you must be having questions to Dr. Monish. So now I open the floor for questions. If you have any questions, comments, then you can raise. Yeah.
Uh, Hi, good morning. So you spoke about the confusion regarding the messages that were sent to mobilize the masses, especially what to do and how to die. And you also spoke about Gandhi's influence and how it reached only till Assam. But although back then Assam was a much bigger state. But if you see India, this freedom struggle in all parts of the country were very different, chiefly where Britishers were not the main oppressors in certain parts. Like you had a red corridor in the Telangana region much before independence. So even Churchill described India at max as a geographical construct. It was not one particular country. We had so many princely states even after independence. So my question to you is, in Aya we talk about defining the other, to fight a particular movement. So how did Gandhiji or the freedom struggle went about defining the British as the other when you had other chief oppressors in all parts of the country?
Yeah. You would answer or you will take a couple of questions? Yeah. Yeah, please.
Yeah. Hi. That was a very passionate presentation. I liked it. But I have a question. I'm still wondering, okay. I'm still wondering, it was a pattern, the way you sequenced events and presented them. It gives a pattern of revolt or a struggle. But it still doesn't explain to me. Of course, I have to do my own research, but it still doesn't answer my question as to why did the British budge, They could have taken a dictatorial position of the extreme kind. It was still a possibility. So why wasn't that considered? It doesn't answer my question yet. So thanks.
Any more? Or any more questions? Yeah, okay. Maybe, yeah.
Okay, thank you. My question is from peaceful protest to violent agitation. And then I just want to know what was Mahatma Gandhi's response to this, and also and again, Franklin D. Roosevelt was one of the firm supporters of India's independence. So how did they react, how did the US reacted to the mass upheaval and uprising in India?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, defining the other. I think it's a dynamic concept, defining the other. How do you define others in different phases of the country's evolution? I think for Gandhi, defining the other, then there is an ultimate other, and then there are other others, right? So there you have an ultimate enemy, you have a prioritization in terms of what do you want to do at a certain point of time. For if you were to enlarge the concept of other for Gandhi, you could say that being dirty was also one of the others of Gandhi. So that's why sanitation, cleanliness, cleanliness, untouchability, the way it was being practiced. Although one can have differing viewpoints, if you read someone like Arundhati Roy, she has a differing viewpoint on how Ambedkar used to look at untouchability and how Gandhi was in for structural untouchability, but the operative means he was, against it. So we can have different views on that. Untouchability was also the other for Gandhi. So I think in terms of if we situate the historical context of what was really happening at that point of time. So the ultimate other, the one that we had to fight, was the British imperialism. So and then we did that in different phases. There was an incrementalism process in terms of how we fought, but even within, you had differences in terms of how to fight the British. All-out assault versus phase struggle, right? So I think it's a dynamic concept that needs to be looked at, like what was the most important agenda at that point of time. And if you look at what the British were trying to do, the divide and rule policy and all, so it also accentuated the process of creating others within the Indian, freedom movement, in the sense that if we look back at Lord Curzon in 1905 and the division of Bengal according to communal electorates, and I think that has extreme repercussions in terms of how communalism develops in India and how the British started supporting the Muslim League idea. For example, even when Stafford Cripps came with a declaration, there was a definite mention that if one of the parties is not willing to negotiate along with the INC, the British would be negotiating with them. So I think, for example, the princely states, the zamindars, there was a constant idea put by the British in terms of how do you create these others within the freedom movement itself? How do you make sure that you create others within the freedom movement, that one party starts looking at the other, some other party as the other, rather than looking at them as one solid base of Indian freedom movement. So I think there is a measure and countermeasure work in terms of how you define the other, which was the British at that point of time, which essentially should be. But the British were also engaging in their own propaganda, in their own machineries, in terms of dividing India all the more, so that different parties within India would, for example, so that Muslim League would see Congress as the other, and the Congress would start seeing Muslim League as the other. And that would be within the mechanization of how British would try to divide, India. As time develops, there are ways in which different parts of the country start seeing who is the other. So in a sense, the state presence becomes very important, right? So for someone who is living in a village, I don't know so much about the Red Corridor, but I will give example from my own state, Manipur. I grew up in Imphal city. So there is a difference of how we look at the state presence, even within Manipur itself. Like, for example, someone who stays in Imphal city, who has more amenities and more connection to the state, compared to, let's say, 100 kilometers down from Imphal into a certain village. Now, when the state presence decreases in certain parts, it becomes easier for insurgent groups to replace the state presence and then make sure that these people start seeing the state as the other, right? So I'll give you an example. I had an interaction, let me divulge it, that he was living close to where I was staying in Delhi, and he's no more now. He was one of the, let's say, surrendered insurgents. So he used to work with the medical team in one of the insurgent groups. Now he told me that this group had organized a medical camp in one of the hill districts in Manipur, and they were surprised to see scores and scores of people crossing hills to come attend the medical camp. What does it say? It tells you about the absence of state presence, relative absence. I'm not saying complete absence. Maybe there are no medical camps where they are living. So it is easier for these people to build a propaganda. See, the state is not caring for you, so the state is your other. I am the one who cares for you. And so it helps them to build a movement against the state. So I think it's a very dynamic concept in terms of how we create others, right? Why did the British not budge? I think there was, if we talk about the Quit India movement, there was, of course, incidents, as I've told you, about complete repression, a complete martial law use in terms of how do you repress the mass struggle. I think it comes from one question that you asked yesterday also, in terms of like why the British were engaged in World War II, and then it was not really the movement, but really the, let's say, the destruction of British power itself, which led Britain to go away from India. I think we cannot look at historical epochs or historical events in silos. We have to look at a number of things. For example, if you read Bose's biographer, Subhash Chandra Bose's biographer, and many other writers, they would have enough example to show you how Subhash Chandra Bose, Azad Hind Force, played a very elemental role in terms of impacting how the British show the movement in India. Other people who do not look at Bose in such terms would paint Bose's contribution in a different way. For example, when members of the Azad Hind Force were brought as prisoners of war in Delhi, that itself, led to the generation of a kind of increased patriotism among the people. So, I think we cannot take out the circumstantial portion of it, in the sense that this also happened to be the time when Britain, there was, let's say, a ship of power base. And it is not World War II itself. The ship of power base was starting from World War I itself. And in the interwar period, it was very evident that which country was going to be the next superpower of the world. And it was quite evident that slowly a time would come when, when or where, in what way, that's a matter of debate. But the decolonization process was something which was, if you read historians of that time, it becomes evidential at that point of time that there was a shifting of power which was happening. So we cannot take out from the, I think there's no point in getting into the debate of who was responsible for what, whether the British defeat was responsible. And if you go by that argument, then you would go by the argument, oh, Gandhi had nothing to do with it. Indians had nothing to do with it. The British had to go anyway. They